Excellent. All right. Inherency. The nursing immigration system is broken. We don't have enough nurses. Other countries have more than they need, and for some reason, we won't let them immigrate. Americans don't want to teach nursing, so domestic training isn't a possibility, and we've tried and failed with temporary visas. From economists Lim and Shakin in 16. Demand for health services is inelastic to economic conditions. Immigration from the Philippines played a critical role in alleviating shortages of nurses. Filipinos represent 5% of nurses, while Filipino nurses fall sharply after 2006. This led and reflect reduced access to employment visa channels. There is no prioritization of nursing as a high shortage occupation. Congress created a new H-1C category, but these visas placed onerous requirements on hospitals. Only 14 hospitals ever succeeded in using the program, resulting in paltry emissions. 5 U.S. educated nurses will fail to keep pace with demand, producing a shortfall with nearly 200,000. Nursing educators have been challenged due to shift in educational settings out of hospitals and into colleges where salaries are lower. Nurses previously could combine teaching with clinical work, and with an either-or choice, they are less inclined to teach. Other countries are producing more nurses than they need. Occupation-specific immigration policy is a complementary solution. And Biden's talk is all talk. No substantive immigration reform will actually pass under his administration. Dallas News in 20. Changes detailed on Biden's website are couched with words such as review. Immigration experts are restrained about the scope of change, especially under COVID. Immigration policy wasn't good under Obama. Not every change can be done by a stroke of a pen. Some will require going through a long regulatory process. Trump made more than 400 changes to the immigration system. Plan. Congress should eliminate the EB-3 visa cap for registered nurses. Solvency. Eliminating the visa cap will eliminate the visa backlog and solve the nursing shortage. Attorney Sabirski in 18. Registered nurses are part of the EB-3 visa category. The EB-3 visa category is experiencing a backlog of 5 years. This backlog eliminates supply for nurses. It is critical that registered nurse visas be exempt from the employment-based green card cap. And nurses have already applied to come to the U.S., and their visas have been processed and approved. All that's left is clearing the backlog. Los Angeles immigration attorneys in 13. The Schedule A designation speed up the application process. The sponsor for nurses by allowing them to skip ahead to filing a petition. Once USCIS approved the application, the nurse is placed in line for a visa. Advantage 1 is mental health nursing. We're in the midst of a severe mental health crisis as a result of the pandemic. A third of Americans have symptoms of anxiety and depression, and suicide rates are up. Health policy analyst Kamal and Panchal in 20. COVID and the recession negatively affected people's mental health. Job loss is associated with increased depression, anxiety, distress, and low self-esteem, and may lead to higher rates of substance use disorder and suicide. 17 million adults and 3 million adolescents had a major depressive episode in the past year. Death due to drug overdose increased more than threefold. Over 48,000 Americans died by suicide. More than 1 in 3 adults reported symptoms of anxiety or depressive disorder during the pandemic. And nurses are crucial to provide accessible mental health care. Without enough nurses, treatment is delayed by decades as people wait for help to become available. Reporter Romero in 19. Only 40% of people with mental illness are receiving mental health care. Millions of American families spend countless agonizing days searching for psychiatric care. Psychiatric mental health nurses can diagnose, treat, order tests, and prescribe medications. Demand for mental health nurses is soaring in healthcare systems, clinics, hospitals, primary care settings, public health, and through telemedicine. And the material shortage of mental health nurses is a result of ableism in which mental illness is stigmatized. Redress is an issue of social justice. Banyan in 18. People view mental health with negative stigma. It's imperative that we move mental health to the forefront of conversation. By talking about mental illness, we will unveil false notions that plague this topic. Open dialogue about mental health can help everyone heal. By talking about mental health openly, people may be encouraged to seek professional help. Advantage 2 is deportation. Over 280,000 healthcare professionals are in the U.S. under DACA protections. COVID has delayed DACA processing, so without visas, they'll be deported. Journalist Livni in 20. Undocumented immigrants play a huge role with 280,000 in healthcare. Having risked their health to tend to Americans, they'll remain underground. These figures underscore the urgency to ensure protection from deportation. DACA recipients have work authorization and must apply to renew every 2 years. Applying for renewal is difficult amid coronavirus. Immigration authorities no longer take applications. Deportation and the threat of deportation is incredibly stressful and have physical and mental health effects on immigrant families. Psychologist Langhoughton, 18. 5.9 million U.S. children have at least one caregiver who does not have authorization. Forcible separation of a family is associated with negative psychosocial effects. Immigration raids show children feeling abandoned, isolated, fearful, traumatized, and depressed. When someone is deported, others in that community become fearful of public institutions, reducing attendance in churches, schools, health clinics, cultural activities, and other social services. Social integration is associated with lower risk of cancer and mortality, lower rates of cardiovascular disease, and lower psychological distress and suicide risk. And advantage 3 is Filipino oversupply. The Philippines train a lot of nurses to send to the U.S. Stringent U.S. visa requirements leave the Philippines with an oversupply. Journalist Melencio in 08. The Philippines has an oversupply of nurses. Schools graduate thousands of nurses. Deployment abroad may be the first choice for these graduates. There is no local demand. U.S. stopped issuing work visas. There were 21,000 Filipino nurses seeking employment in the U.S. An oversupply causes nurses to accept unpaid volunteer opportunities in hopes of eventual employment. This is a form of exploitation. From GMA News in 11. Hospitals accept new registered nurses as volunteers. Aside from providing free labor, the nurses had to pay so-called training fees. Hospitals cut costs. Number of unemployed Filipino nurses range from 160,000 to 200,000. Thousands went to hospitals to pay for the limited volunteer nurse slots. It is exploitation. Get a framework. Solving injustice comes first. Injustice creates constant violence and operates as a threat multiplier. It's high duration and has generational effects, from Nixon and 11. Violence is conceived as an event that is immediate. We need to engage in violence that is incremental across a range of temporal scales. Rethinking requires we complicate assumptions about violence as event-focused. Slow violence is exponential. Operating as a threat multiplier, it can fuel long-term conflicts where conditions for sustaining life become gradually degraded. And you should use probability as your first weighing mechanism. Direct effects of the plan are more likely than far-fetched extinction scenarios or critiques of problems we can't really solve. 1, the plan isn't the only policy Congress will ever pass, so if the situation escalates, the government will pass more policies to intervene instead of just saying, oh, well, guess we all die. 2, there are infinite unknown existential risks in the world. Under a 1% risk doctrine, we can neither act nor not asked, because there's always some risk. From Meeskill in 09, 1% doctrine cannot be applied in a world with many disaster scenarios. Each risk on the 1% doctrine deserves all attention. We cannot address all of them simultaneously. We constantly risk death to pursue things we value. Any creature that adopted the precautionary principle would neither be able to act nor not act, since it would never discover perfect safety. 3, myopic focus on extinction events causes systemic neglect of non-existential impacts, which isolates debate from academic discourse. And 4, focusing on structural violence and problems existing now is empirically the only way to create effects that solve catastrophe. From Kornofsky in 14. Reject the placing value on the far future makes it clear one should focus on reducing catastrophes, focus on short-term higher certainty opportunities to do good. Minimize existential risk, include contribution to human empowerment, track record, strong opportunities to do something good is better than high uncertainty arguments about where the highest utility lies. Developments that facilitate a strong growth have been driven by the former, not many in the latter yielded benefits. Tangible considerations do good in ways they wouldn't foresee. I'm ready for cross.
Alrighty. Sam, are you good as well? So the argument that you make with the framework is that we should solve injustice first. Some of the arguments under probability would articulate why only extinction focus would be bad. Do you think they would also apply to just a small consideration? Because you talk about existential risk as well, just like what leads up to it.
I guess I don't know what you're asking. Can you clarify that?
About way of saying, can we care about extinction and solve injustice?
My argument is that we need to prioritize high probability impacts, which likely means direct non-existential impacts, and solving injustice. That means that no, I would frame out extinction focus.
Okay, define what injustice is.
Define it?
Yeah.
I would argue that things like exploitation and violations of rights are injustice. I would argue that resource disparities between different populations can constitute a form of injustice.
Can constitute? I want to know like a clear, bright line. What is injustice and what's not?
I mean, I don't have like a dictionary definition that's like, this is a comprehensive way to say what counts as injustice. I think that there are some things that are clearly unjust. So instances in which people are exploited for their labor are clearly unjust. Instances in which one population is devalued just on the basis of something that's not their fault, for instance, ableism, those kind of things seem clearly unjust to me.
All right, let's talk about the Filipino oversupply argument. You say that people in the Philippines are trained to be nurses to come to the United States, and when there's an oversupply, they become volunteers. Why don't they go to other countries that are facing nursing shortages like India?
A couple reasons. The first is that they get paid a lot more in the United States, so there's a lot more incentive to come to the US and to pay the travel costs, relocation costs, etc. The second is that they already do send nurses to a lot of other countries, and those nurses are potentially filling, their immigration quotas or their nursing quotas as well.
Oh, so there's literally no nursing shortages happening right now? Like there's no place for them to apply except for the United States and their backlog?
I didn't say there are no nursing shortages. I said that these nurses want to come specifically to the US and that they might have trouble in other countries with regards to the other countries' immigration systems the way they do with the US.
Come to the United States, that's an injustice?
The fact that this oversupply of nurses is leading to these nurses being exploited as free labor is a form of injustice, because you should not exploit people.
Options that they're not taking, correct?
What did you say?
There are other options that they're not taking in other countries where there are shortages, right?
I don't think there are. I mean, you can provide evidence. This card talks about how they come to the US.
I got it there. Let's go to mental health. You see that ableism is why there's a shortage of mental health nurses, but this card just talks about the importance of talking about mental health. Why does that say that ableism causes a shortage?
It talks about the stigma. Just like when we don't focus on it, that means that the problems get neglected.
Do you claim a pre-fiat benefit from this advantage?
No.
Okay. Let's talk about the deportation argument. So where's the link that they'll be deported? Under my understanding is yes, DACA applications have stopped, but deportations aren't happening because they haven't.
It talks in this card about how they have to renew their DACA applications so that they don't get deported, and that renewals have stopped because of coronavirus. It also talks about how that fear of deportation is an independent impact.
Okay. 4 minutes, 21. All right, 320 remaining. The order is 4 off, case in order of framing, and then advantages. Oh, we lost Sarah. There you are.
I have no idea what happened. I think it was a Wi-Fi issue. I'm so sorry. If I cut out again, I'll let you know.
Okay, great. Just like stop your timer if you cut out. And like if you can, I have Zoom open to where I can see if something drops.
Yeah, that's what I'm doing too. You also presumably have a document.
Yeah.
Cool. We'll figure it out.
Document is in the speech drop. Are you good, Sarah? Okay. Sam? Great. First off is topicality. The act must get rid of plural statutory restrictions on legal immigration into the United States. Remove means to eliminate. Merriam-Webster no date. Remove to get rid of, eliminate. And statutory restrictions or controls on legal immigration by ruling legislation. Law Dictionary access in 2020. Statutory restriction limits or controls on activities based on ruling legislation. You violate. 1. There's no official restrictions specifically on registered nurses. Plain text only references a cap placed on nurses, but that cap isn't codified. It's a cap that everyone else in EB3s are subjected to. 2nd, plain text refers to a singular cap, which means you're also not plural. It destroys real world education for plain text in a vacuum. 3, exempting someone from a restriction is distinct from removing a restriction. There's no restriction specific to nurses. Merriam-Webster no date. Free release from one liability requirement which others are subject to the definition of exempt. And prefer. 1, ground. Coordinate ground is predicated on the full removal of restrictions. They can pick or choose which people they let in, i.e. let in magicians and exempt them from the cap. DAs or links are predicated on large changes like cap removals, which they destroy, which only one restriction which they purely exempt people from makes it impossible to engage the negative, which collapses fairness in education. 2, limits. There are infinite exceptions which can be made to increase the space under the EB3 visa caps. They've justified all apps which exempt specific companies, universities, or any other entity, which is the endless, which will never be able to prompt. There's already 185 different types of visa categories, and removing more than one restriction certainly ensures our plep matters. They force a negative generic immigration bad and tease a voter per NFA rules, and we also need to have a fair and educational stasis for debate in order for us to debate over things. And competing in terms, so vote for the best interest to avoid a race at the bottom. T-comes first, it's a question of what we debate before how we debate. Now takes. A bipartisan compromise on COVID relief likely. Biden push key failure risk recession. Tarnowski et al. Yesterday. Biden the vaccine shift to Congress leading to a bipartisan negotiations empowering compromise. Biden used public appearance to encourage the quick aid package. Pelosi and Schumer announced support for the restarted negotiations. Republicans also coalescing between the $908 billion framework that economic stability recession. But the Biden's walking a delicate path towards compromise. Trump getting close to the open years. Nasty compromises their best interest, even with renewed movements of a deal far from ensure McConnell, who's acknowledged a full sense to stop short of endorsing the compromise. Even so, a smaller deal would leave it with the opportunity for another relief package under Biden adamant. And B, not enough time or capital for immigration reform and COVID relief. Plan pushes relief off the agenda. Rescind 20. With COVID crisis, immigration reform might have to wait to approve a new stimulus package. Could take months. Immigration reform might be very vigorous opposition. That's bad when they're trying to have a unified response to COVID. Biden wants to slow walk changes. There's a lot of the agenda, and immigration is a sticky issue. Dems have been unwilling to take. Biden plans might face another challenge. Yet another challenge. Time. C. Subsequent economic decline and disrupted trade expectations decimate interdependence. Nuclear war. 2015. Nuclear deterrence and economic interdependence reduce the risk of war between major powers. Negative trade expectations generate tensions leading to trade wars among interdependent states. To increase the risk of military conflict with leaders fear the nations decline the plans to total independence and refuse to be deterred. Nuclear arms are dangerous to the happen of the greatest source that changes the world economy that render peace more precarious. Deterrence is credibility. Great powers gamble that the real cyber war, conventional war also matters under their framework because it supports small businesses and also gives money direct payments to families and children, which is something that they need in order to stop from the slip in poverty. And recessions definitely impact people, and they impact people of color and disabled bodies. The worst, which is clearly injustice. We access it much much better and it's more intersectional. And now backlash. A, rapid expansion of immigration without safeguards hurts competing workers. This leads to political backlash, resentment, hospital closures, and turnover increases. Williams 20. Registered nurses persistently treat foreign nurses as grossly inferior. Foreign educated registered nurses also feel like outsiders. Members encourage racism, experiencing horizontal violence, and dispersal, lack of collegiality in the U.S. nursing profession is one of the leading causes of registered nurses turnover. The disruptive environment of the effect of the medical personnel, patients, and services leading to cancellation of operations, unit closure, layoffs, and raising unemployment. On the rise, though many more individuals and returning registered nurses are likely to enter and re-enter the nursing profession, and deepening of the animosity among registered nurses might prevail when the competition for nursing positions occurs will further strengthen the lack of collegiality. Also leads to injustice. That racism that happens towards registered nurses turns all of your dissads. We shouldn't subject them to a society that's clearly racist. B, permissive immigration policy collapses U.S. democratic model and turns case. Martin 20. Skillful playing the immigration backlash provided a model for autocrats and effectiveness immigration policy that ends wider consequences. Extremist parties find the richest opportunities to influence authoritarian features and to stalwart democracies. The United States is vulnerable. Our democracy is fragile to preserve political space for open immigration policy and reserve authoritarianism. We need the rule of law and public perception. C, existential crisis coming. We need a survival depends on domestic commitment to preservation of liberal democratic norms. Also key to resolve any injustice, which means that we're a prerequisite. So Tarman 20. The neoliberal wave is coming to a close. The coming era will be health crisis, climate, cyber attacks, geo-economic competition. Each of the challenges, whether it needs to be a democracy, these challenges between household and endure necessary grand strategy of resilience to reduce authorize go for the American policy maker to preserve the constitutional democracy better prepared to make the crisis banning strategy to the domestic foundation. Now, brain drain. A, American harsh immigration policies led to a massive return on immigrants to India. Satal 17. In President's time in office, for 2.4 million Indian nationals living in the U.S., roughly 1 million are scientists, so there's thousands still live in thesis and starts the election. The number of Indian residents searching for jobs in India is climbing the temple. The more application being challenged, those trouble a lot of American first executive order why students come in the path that does not exist. And B, preventing the rate and pulling talent back to India is the limited professional countries essential for sustained economic growth. Roman 2020. Landmark elections to slowing the piece of China interested in India's outcome to turn around growth and the need for qualified professionals and increase while India is a huge workforce majority unskilled, leading to scarcity skills at all levels of domestic supplies. It stem flow of the talent out of the key to grow, continue to grow and development to happen. Full qualified professionals to leave the country, convincing the comeback when India diaspora when they continue the time is certainly right. And their inherency evidence is that nurses will come from India, China, and Philippines. Migration exacerbates India's shortage of nurses, which is one of the world's most severe, replicates their impacts even worse. Sharma 20. India is set to face the biggest shortage of the nurses in the world. Healthcare workers migrated about there's 1.7 nurses per 1,000 people. The current health crisis is just the force of the shortage in nurses. India's was made for worsen into COVID-19 crisis surge. And this plan replicates the same hearts of the YAF, it's just a more vulnerable population. We're not going to go for the Sandy 12 evidence, but there's clearly a structural impact to this now on framing. Their causal framing ignores how the risk of offense functions. We are never positing there's 100% risk of the disadvantaged impact occurs, but we instead suggesting optimism is the plan that needs to be structured through the possibility of our impact. Just because it isn't guaranteed doesn't mean our impact is unknowable. Instead, they need to prove why risk calc should flip towards probability away from magnitude. Additionally, they read no evidence that extinction reps aren't good. That's just the Sarah's assertions. There's over 100,000 articles published on Google Scholar about human extinction. There's no real reason why they don't contribute to academia. For example, how immigration affects foreign policy, terrorism, or the economy are all highly academic and relevant discussions. They just don't want to have these debates. And extinction discourses are good. Epstein 9. Only by evaluating the extinction to the level of the scenarios that the professional discourse prioritize the change to involve communicating things that are serious. The road to extinction does lie ahead. The realization constructing a new social ethic that dismisses human nature. And extinction requires some sort of injustice be upheld. If anything, it's extinction affects people of color worse. So obviously there's injustice that happened through extinction. So we can weigh extinction under the framework. We're not going to read any of the other arguments. Now, on the advantage, hospitals are laying off nurses. Now there's a surplus for 2020. This spike in demand for healthcare workers never materialized. Demand actually felt healthcare workers found themselves being laid off. The unemployment nurses have remained above the pre-pandemic levels. The average nurses, the unemployment rate of 2.7% higher than the pre-pandemic level. It's unclear how jobs new nurses would fill in the demand increases. Americans increasingly lost their jobs. The obvious source for workers to draw from. Not reading the next card. Now on mental health. Top barriers to mental health don't include number of providers. Each barrier from solvency and it's BH 18. Common barriers remained adequate funding to hire staff, employee practices, and adapt, innovate, detect high cost and insufficient insurance coverage. Everyone one of four having to choose between getting mental health treatment and paying for daily necessity. Window options, long waits. 96 million Americans wait longer than 1 week for mental health trial. Now, cut the card at health. Go to deportation. Actually, I'm not going to read this. Deportation argument doesn't matter because they're not being risk. There's not a fear of deportation right now because they aren't allowing for DACA reapplications. So deportation is stopped as well. So didn't read the last three cards in the document. The Biden solves nursing shortages. Did not read, not the last three, the last two in the document. Biden solves nursing shortages in the last two under framework. Did not read nor the C under brain drain.
Yep. I got it flowed, I think. You good for cross?
Mm-hmm.
Sam, you good? Would you argue that extinction impacts come first?
Mm-hmm.
Yes?
Yes.
Okay. Let's talk about backlash.
Your arguments, you don't include ours. Seems to be the better strategy for debate. We also say it's the most moral.
Yeah, okay. Backlash. This B card talks about how the reason permissive immigration policy collapses the democratic model is because there would be backlash from
Mhm.
extremists. Yes.
Yeah.
So, ending slavery also faced quite a lot of backlash from extremists that caused a civil war. Should that policy not have been passed due to the risk?
So the way that it happened, we say that the United States is uniquely vulnerable. The events that led up to um, removing slavery, the Americans' democracy wasn't as fragile as it now. We say that under Trump right now, the democracy is incredibly fragile. So we should wait until there's a clear transition away from extremist parties. I would also argue that extremists are probably worse now than they were then.
So, like, we elected a racist president, so now we deserve the racist policy that's implemented?
Uh, we elected a racist president because there are racists here that will do materially violent things and ruin the democracy for decades to come. Yes.
So, this existential crisis is coming card.
Mm-hmm.
It talks about can you just like read me the line that talks about how US democracy at this moment is uniquely crucial? I get that it talks about neoliberalism.
Mm-hmm. It says the highest goal for American policymakers should be to preserve constitutional democracy so we are better prepared to face the next crisis. Any true strategy requires a domestic foundation. Plan removes that.
Okay, so walk me through this link. How is democracy uniquely going to solve cyber attacks?
Okay. So cyber attacks depends on that's from the cyber topic. You should know whenever we have a commitment to United States democracy, we are, helping other countries. We're not treating them as enemies, which means that they don't have an incentive to take APTs against us, which is advanced persistent threats. Those cyber attacks don't happen in a world where we have a domestic commitment to liberal norms.
Okay, so let's talk about this COVID relief compromise. What incentive does Trump have to sign a COVID relief compromise when his base doesn't think COVID exists and he's not dependent on voters now that he lost the election?
He's already said that he wants it to happen.
What incentive does McConnell have to pass even the present bipartisan COVID bill?
Kentucky really wants a COVID bill. Like I live in Kentucky, Brashear is the best governor on COVID, and Brashear is still someone that is popular. Uh, McConnell's stance on COVID is why he was so close between him and McGrath. It wasn't that close, but it was closer than he thought it was going to be.
Closer than it should have been. All right. Economic decline leads to nuclear war. How much does the economy have to decline for this to happen?
Enough for trade expectations to fall.
Okay, nothing further. I'm going to take prep. All right, stopping prep. I have 240s. Let me save and upload. Okay, doc should be up. It's going to be topicality and then a broad just like overview. COVID bill, backlash, brain drain, and then case in order of framing, and then the rest straight down.
Where should I flip the overview?
I would do a new sheet. It's just going to be some like contextualization. This is a collapse strategy that might not be the most expected, so helps to signpost. All right.
Alrighty, I am good to go.
Awesome. Topicality, I meet their interpretation. I remove visa restrictions for nurses, and I meet their interpretation. I remove restrictions on multiple nurses immigrating. That meets the definition of restrictions plural. Next, counterinterpret restriction is a mass noun. That means it can't be pluralized. So as long as the F reduces the amount to which the government restricts immigration, it's topical. Lexicon 20. Restriction, mass noun, the limitation or control of someone or something. And removing a restriction can end it or take something away from it. As long as the F lets more immigrants into the U.S., it's topical. Lexico Dictionary 20. Remove, take something away or off from the position occupied. I take something away from the INA by removing caps on nurses. Standards 1. Ground, their interp requires huge apps. We can raise visa caps, so the neg would always win on a pick to include fewer immigrants. Their topical version of my app would require me to eliminate all EB3 visa caps, which means they could pick just to allow nurses into the U.S. and then get whatever ground from other EB3 visas. That excludes affirmatives about things like climate scientists, country-specific refugees, nuclear scientists, etc. Picks are uniquely bad. They skew time. They would allow the neg to moot 100% of offense and skew this topic neg. 2. Framers' intent. We had a comprehensive immigration reform resolution choice and didn't pick it. To finagle this resolution into CIR would make the voting process virtually worthless. A democratic voting process is independently key to fair democratic process. It outweighs in around fairness since one round won't matter long term, but the topic choice is about everyone having a voice and where the community goes. And 3. Lit. The literature isn't written with our topic wording in mind. Removing parts of restrictions is key to access the lit base. Lit is always crucial to pre-round prep, which controls ground since you need cards to win. And affirmative ground comes first since the neg always gets access to things like generics, like politics and critiques. And 4. Extra T is good in this context since it boosts link ground, ensures clash, and gives us a more holistic view of the topic lit, which benefits education. They still get their links. I don't know why the reasonability stuff isn't in the stock, but you should vote on reasonability above competing interpretations. First, because T is an accusation of cheating, which means that you should presume innocent until proven guilty. Second, because topicality is something that can't be straight-turned, which means that the negative is always at a benefit. And third, because it deters frivolous theory and allows us to have more topical debate, which is better for education. Go to their standards. First, they tell you that this is necessary for ground. You should prefer affirmative ground to negative ground first because of the issue of how they have generics. They claim that we take away their generics, but no, they still get access to things like politics, to things like brain drain, to things like borders critiques, which they read in this debate, which means that answers that back. Also, affirmative ground comes first since the affirmative is the one who has to do pre-round prep, and the neg can just make analytic responses. Then they tell you that we underlimit the topic, but we've answered that. We didn't pick a comprehensive resolution reform topic, and the term substantial answers this back. Don't let them do Wang in the next speech. They should have done it in the first speech like we did. Okay. Overview. They told you in cross-ex that extinction comes first, which means we are going to kick out of everything and go for turns on the COVID bill, argue that economic growth is bad, it causes extinction, and that is a prior question for their analysis and cross-examination. They don't give you existential impacts off brain drain. They don't give you existential impact off of the escalating conflict between out of the COVID bill here, which means that their only existential risks are from backlash. If I answer backlash sufficiently, then I can win. The DDEV is the biggest existential risk. That also is probably going to answer all of their case argumentation, because we get a perceptual benefit to preventing this bill from being passed and preventing econ collapse, which means that's going to be the way that we're winning the debate. All right, DDEV. 1, we're at peak everything. Running out of water, topsoil, fossil fuels, and key minerals that drive the economy. Collapse is inevitable. Heinberg 10. Water strain. We lose 24 billion tons of topsoil each year to erosion. Economically significant minerals are depleting quickly. Peak oil is leading edge of peak everything. This has taken place in fixed source of non-renewable resources. Limited ability to regenerate forest, fish, fresh water, and topsoil, and a limited ability to absorb industrial waste. Slowly landing at the end of a brief pulse, inevitably followed by contraction as fuels deplete. 2, collapse sooner rather than later is the only way to prevent extinction through ecological collapse. Berry 08. Growth is the primary factor driving emissions. Growth pushes the planet beyond its ecological carrying capacity and can only lead to human extinction and an end to complex life. Economic growth destroys ecosystems. It may be better that economic collapse comes sooner. While more ecosystems and opportunities to return to nature's fold exist, we were a couple decades at most away from a societal strife of a much greater magnitude as the biosphere fail's revolutionary response would bring down the economy now. And you should prefer this analysis to their war claims because ecological collapse would cause the extinction of all life on Earth, which means it outweighs on magnitude. It also outweighs on time frame and probability. Warming is definitely happening now and definitely accelerating. 3. Continued growth drives war over increasingly scarce resources from Trainer in 98. There are not enough resources for all to rise to the living standards we take for granted. As population doubles and resources become scarcer, there can be no other outcome than conflict. We have to be involved in military activity to secure supply. We could not be sure of getting oil if we did not have the military presence warn others they better not interfere with our oil fields. Expansion is a prime source of conflict. 4. Economic growth drives creation of chemicals that prevent reproduction and cause extinction. Due to 99. The economy is unsustainable. Chemicals in place disrupt the endocrine system. Sperm counts have been falling since these chemicals came into use after the Second World War. The chemicals increased testicular and breast cancer. The economic system is undermining humanity's ability to reproduce itself. And 5. Economic growth requires continual exploitation of ocean ecosystems, which causes ocean acidification and ecosystem collapse by 2050. Clark and Klaus in 08. Ecological degradation under capitalism extends to the entire biosphere. Oceans are being decimated by exploitative economic operations. Ecological processes are undermined by overfishing, and global warming. Capital cannot operate under conditions that require reinvestment in nature, which may entail 100 or more years. Cut there. And economic decline doesn't cause war. It's proven by empirics from the Great Recession. They don't tell you war goes nuclear, and they don't give you any analysis as to how far the economy would have to decline from Dressner and 12. Analysts asserted financial crisis would lead to diversionary wars or great power conflict. Data suggests otherwise. Peacefulness in 2012 is the same as 2007. Interstate violence declined since the financial crisis. The Great Recession has not triggered increase in violent conflict. The crisis has not generated protectionist nationalism or ethnic exclusion. Go to backlash. DDA probably turns their impacts. We're going to be better able to solve these kind of issues if we have a developed economy that's going to lead to smaller, peaceful communities. It's also going to prevent the kind of ecological collapse that is causing a lot of these issues in the first place. Also, turn the plan solves because increased immigration leads to increased contact, which decreases prejudice and racism. Professors Rishma and Noguchi in 20. Intergroup contact theory, positive bringing groups into contact with each other will promote more positive attitudes toward the other. A meta-analysis of 515 studies found that physical interaction of groups decreases prejudice, which means as immigrants enter the U.S., then racists understand that people who aren't white also aren't terrible too. We shouldn't give the racists what they want, failing to pass positive policy because some KKK-friendly white dudes hate brown people is racist and empowers the alt-right to influence policy. 3. Turn alt-right violence is up now and government support spurs their movements, demonstrated by Trump's Proud Boys comment. We need to spur empathy instead. From Guardian reporter Levin on 10-2. Far-right violence escalated dramatically under Trump's standby remark his explicit approval of violent white nationalism groups see this as tacit permission to ramp it up. Cut there.
All right, I had it's written down somewhere. I think it was 320. There's so many sheets of paper. They're sticking together. Sarah, do you have written down how much cup I have? 320. Yep, I got it.
That's right.
All right, starting it now. All right. I will, it's just like one card. It is sent. All right, the order is tea. I like that smile, Sam. I hope that means good things. All righty. Everyone good? Great. This round is really easy when Sarah doesn't define the term statutory restriction, which is a term of art, which means you can auto negate on this issue. Like, go to the interpretation. The AF must get rid of plural statutory restrictions on legal immigration into the United States. The remove means to eliminate. That was Merriam-Webster. It means to get rid of completely. Now, statutory restrictions are controls on legal immigration by ruling legislation. That was from the Law Dictionary. You talk about how we need to be real world and how policymakers do, especially with the literature. Well, the literature talks about ruling legislation because statutory restrictions is a necessary term of art. So defining one of the two words in a term of art doesn't mean that you're actually getting at any sort of framer's intent, which means we control the internal link to your arguments. Now, go to the violations. Our first argument is that there are no official restrictions on registered nurses. Your plan text doesn't make any sense. It also probably doesn't get a hold of what the ground framer's intent or lit is, because there is no such thing as a restriction on a registered nurse. There's a restriction on an EB3 visa, which a registered nurse would apply for, but you only reference a cap placed on nurses, and you've conceded plain text in a vacuum. Now, you've also conceded that you reference a singular cap, which means from the 1AC, you set it up as a debate that only once a singular restriction moved. Now, 3, exempting someone from a restriction is distinct from removing the restriction. There's no restriction specific to nurses. This Merriam-Webster argument is very clear that when you exempt someone, you free or release them from some requirement that others are subject to, i.e. registered nurses are no longer subject to the cap that other people that hold the same exact visa that they do are required to. We define an opposite word, which means an opposite word that your counterinterpret would necessarily exclude, doesn't account for, which means we have a better clear limit as to what allows for a removal, which means that our limits standard is definitely multiplied on this fact. But yeah, let's go to the standards debate. Extend ground. Coordinate ground is predicated on a full removal of restrictions. When you only remove it for specific populations, that means you can cherry pick a specific kind of scientist and read a new affirmative each round. DA links are predicated on large shifts in a specific job occupation that someone has. Doesn't give us that large shift in order us to have the rhetoric of what our link evidence does, like cap removals, which is what our link evidence needs. You destroy with only one restriction, which they purely exempt people from. You conceded that, and it makes it impossible to engage with the negative, which collapses fairness in education because we lose all of our generics. You make the argument that negs have generics, like we have text, we have ticks, the borders K, as well as brain drain, but all of those are also at risk whenever you only apply it for one person, because you can make the argument, oh, nurses are popular, literally moots all of our offense because it's not an immigration reform, it's a nurses exemption form. It's not even caring about the rest of immigration. Now go to limits. There are infinite exemptions which are made to increase space under other EB visa caps. There's 5 EB visa categories and other visas that could be affected under the plan, so under the model the plan allows, which they've justified for infinite apps that exempt specific companies, people, universities, or any other entity, like a specific nationality of an indigenous island. This endless list we can never prep, and there's already 185 different visa categories, which removing more than one restriction ensures that our prep matters. When you only have one restriction and you're even just exempting people from it, that means that we can never engage because you're one visa category, but you're not even having everyone underneath that. Obviously, there's a way for affirmatives to spin that they are not the same thing as large shifts in immigration reform, like our link ground is predicated on, which means that the limits and what you justify under this topic is awful. You say that we didn't pick the CIR topic and that substantial would be able to solve that, but we say you wouldn't be removing substantial statutory restrictions when you only remove one restriction, and 2, it's not even a statutory restriction that you remove because you don't list any ruling legislation, and 3, it's not even a removal, you're an exemption, which means that you don't even meet the fact that you say that you're substantial. And also comprehensive immigration reform is distinct from immigration reform. I'll give you that, but that doesn't mean that you are allowed to just do it for specific people. Again, that's not immigration reform. That's something similar to a nurse's reform. Now, let's go to there are meets. The first argument you make is that you remove visa restrictions for nurses. One, we say that those don't exist. There aren't visa restrictions for nurses. There are visa restrictions for EB3 visas, which nurses can't apply for. Second, you say that you remove restrictions on multiple nurses immigrating. It's not a question on how many people. It is a question on how many restrictions that you remove. And it's a question of statutory restrictions, but you read none of them, and you can't make that new articulation. Protect the 2N. Now, your counterinterp says that restriction is a mass noun. One, you don't define statutory restriction means that it automatically doesn't apply. Two, it is countable. Collins Dictionary No Date. Plural restrictions is a countable noun, official rule that limits, which means, yes, obviously there's some discretion, which means that you can definitely count laws and how people are restricted, like per country cap and overall cap. Those are two restrictions. I counted them. Obviously means that you can. Now in Lexico Dictionary, you say removing a restriction can end it or take something away from it. We say that this all that has terrible limits. You can cross apply how that leads for an infinite number of affirmatives that apply to specific people that you probably don't even meet substantial. Now you say that you remove something from the INA, but no mention of the INA in your argument, so don't allow this. You say ground because we require huge apps. We don't require huge apps. I think only removing 2 caps from EB3 is not a huge affirmative by any means. Also, you can gain ground from climate scientists and why that would probably pair well with mental health or whatever. Now, framers' intent is a bad metric for debate. We can't attend just because Chad intended something when he framed the topic that he wrote doesn't mean that that's something that we should have for debate. It's a question of literature. Now, you say the lit isn't written for a topic wording in mind, but we've made the articulation why yes, it is. Statutory restrictions is a term of art. Now, you say extra T is good, but we don't read an extra T standard, so that shouldn't matter. Now, reasonability is something that's incredibly arbitrary and justifies judge intervention because everyone has different ideas of what's reasonable and it develops into competing interests. Also, potential abuse is a voter. All of the arguments we've made is why you could skew out or ground as a reason as to why that would be. It is relevant to PT. Absent debating the topic, there's no reason what the plan is a reason to affirm the resolution.
I'll take the rest of my prep. I think I have 120.
Oh, I wrote down that you had 240. I think you used 120.
No, used 240.
I used 240.
My bad.
I have 120, yeah.
Carry on with your 120 then, sorry.
Yep. Okay, that is time. I'm going to give you an overview, and then we're going to talk about the voters on topicality, interpretation standards. Everyone ready? There's an easy way out and a hard way out in this debate. The easy way out is that they conceded extra topicality is good, which means even if parts of my affirmative are outside the scope of the topic, that's a good thing because it grants more link ground, it grants more education. That means that you can vote on basically this kind of topicality bad argumentation. The second way out is that they've conceded that we need to distinguish this topic as immigration reform away from a comprehensive immigration reform topic, and that is a prior question to fairness in education because it's a determination of the type of topic that we want. So let's start on the voters level. Extent reasonability, that's going to be big in this debate because it means that if you think that the debate is essentially a tie or it's too messy to evaluate you, presume affirmative. They've conceded justifications that topicality is something that can't be straight turned, that it's an accusation of cheating and I should be considered innocent until proven guilty, and that it deters frivolous theory. Their only response to reasonability is that it's arbitrary, but it's not. I give you a bright line that indicates that if there is ground for both sides under an interpretation, then that justifies reasonability. I'll also articulate that if I'm winning a standard that's probably going to be reasonable, they claim that it's arbitrary with no warranting as to why it is. Also, the fact that topicality authorities an accusation of cheating and people should be innocent until proven guilty is going to outweigh their arbitrariness. Remember, they give you justifications as to why democracy is crucial, which means that these kinds of things, such as focus on innocence until proven guilt, is important. Also, reasonability is just a way to decide in a close debate between which way you presume. Okay, let's go back to the interpretations. You'll prefer my interpretation that the affirmative is allowed to remove a restriction by eliminating, taking something away from that restriction, that counts as a removal, and that restrictions is a mass noun, which means that we are able to take something away from a single restriction, and that's topical. Look, this ground is going to be on the resolution regardless. There's either going to be the affirmative ground, the affirmative gets to do this, or it's going to be that the affirmative has to do huge Fs and the negative gets this ground in terms of picks. That's probably worse. They'll tell you I don't define statutory restrictions, but remember that when you're talking about grammar, it's probably going to be a dictionary that's going to be better, right? So if I'm winning that this kind of restrictions can be a mass noun, at this point there's discrepancy in what dictionary definitions are, and you'll default to the standards. They tell you that I'm not a statutory restriction. I discuss the INA in the affirmative. There's no reason to believe this kind of argumentation. My interpretation is better. We're going for the framers' intent standard because they mishandled it. Framers' intent standard indicates that the reason why we need to have a resolution that allows for smaller apps is because this is the resolution that the community voted for over the comprehensive immigration reform resolution, which means that we need to have a way to distinguish between those two resolutions to make the democratic process worthwhile. Otherwise, it's just going to be a couple debaters who are setting the norms on a topic, and the democratic process isn't going to matter. That process is a prerequisite to fairness in education. It's possible that we just pick a resolution that's really unfair and uneducational. You should still vote on the resolution that we have. However, that process is crucial to ensure that everyone's voices get heard. They tell you that this is a bad metric because the framers' intent doesn't matter. I would argue that democracy in this case definitely matters. They've conceded it's a prior question because it's a question of procedural fairness, the way that we make these decisions, which means that that's why you should prefer my interpretation.
Can we do an air hug, Sarah?
What?
Can we do like an air hug?
Yes.
An air high five, but that's not the same.